The PoE 2 Dawn of the Hunt livestream just ended. In that video we got a bunch of new info about the Huntress class and the Ascendancies that are coming along with it. So in this video we're going to go into some of those nodes in the Ascendancy tree and kind of work backwards from there to put together what some potential builds will be for the Huntress class and what'll probably be good when 0.2.0 finally goes live. Let's jump in. Before we get too far down in the weeds here, I do want to call out that quite a bit is supposed to be changing to kind of the core systems of Path of Exile 2 with this 0.2.0 patch. So I'll do my best to kind of speculate around things that I don't anticipate to majorly change, but kind of view all of this through this lens of, you know, there's a bit of an unknown element here in how the game will actually feel and how some of these mechanics will function. But I think there's some assumptions we can make, and I'll try to kind of work within that framework as we go through these Ascendancy trees that we've seen. So with that in mind, let's talk about the Amazon Ascendancy. The Huntress is introducing the spear and buckler weapons to the game. As you can see, that's kind of embodied by the shape of these Ascendancy trees here. Also worth noting that the trees are branching off of this kind of lower right node. This is where the Ranger starts right now. We'll go look at the passive tree kind of as a whole towards the end of the video, and we'll talk about, you know, what nodes are going to be interesting there, what I do and don't expect to see change. But let's just start with these Ascendancy nodes overall, because I think that these can kind of inform us as to what will likely be potent with this class. Let's start with the stuff on the buckler. We'll start with Mystic Harvest here, and we'll kind of work our way around. Mystic Harvest, to kick us off, gives you elemental damage life leech in addition to just your physical damage, and the node along the route to it gives you 12% increase life leech. Life leech is an interesting mechanic. I think the problem with it right now is that how players tend to die in PoE, especially later into the endgame, is getting one-shot or nearly one-shot by bosses, essentially taking a bunch of damage really fast. And a lot of the time, your life leech isn't ticking when that's happening, or if it is, it's too slow to actually like prevent you from dying. So with that in mind, I'm a little bit skeptical that this will often get pulled. Again, maybe with some mechanical changes, life leech will be a little bit stronger, or maybe with elemental damage like firing really quickly, this will work, but I'm a little bit skeptical of it in its current form. Kind of continuing around the circle, we'll talk about Azemri Brew and Flask Recovery here. Flasks in general, I think, are not often the problem. Again, like when players die, it's a similar problem to Life Leech. It's because you're taking a bunch of damage really quickly, and either you don't have time to pop a flask, or if you do pop a flask, like it doesn't, you know, it doesn't overcome the damage that you're taking. Very seldom have I been in a situation where I didn't have enough flask charges, and that's what actually led to death. It seems like my flask recovery has usually been okay on the builds that I've run. And again, maybe some of that's changing here, but unless there's major changes there, I don't foresee this being super interesting. Having life and mana flasks both refill each other, like, kind of cool, I guess. Maybe there's some other like interesting uniques or something that this could interact with, but in its base form, again, I don't think this will be super handy for most builds. The last set of kind of defensive nodes here are Stalking Panther and the Evasion node that supports it. Evasion is interesting. It's kind of complicated. We did a whole video on Evasion. I'll link to it here, how the formula works, how all of the math is calculated there. But something to note is that Evasion is actually capped, so the highest evasion rating you can ever get is 95%. So I'm curious by doubling everything, like you will very easily hit that cap all the time, and if maybe some of the benefit of this node will be wasted because of that. But with that in mind, this is, I think, maybe the node that has the most potential because it is damage mitigation. I think there are some problems with evasion right now. It's a little bit inconsistent. It's kind of hard to know when your evasion is working and when you're being attacked. But again, I'll link to the video here where we go into the mechanics of evasion, and unless that system is majorly overhauled, I don't expect this set of nodes to be super potent either. The last set of kind of defensive nodes here are the Stalking Panther and the Evasion nodes supporting it. Essentially, these just make your evasion rating a lot higher. We did a whole video on how evasion is calculated and chance to hit and all of that. I'll link to that here. It's a little bit complicated, so just fair warning. But the The problem that I foresee with this is that evasion is actually capped at 95% against a certain target, you know, so against a given enemy, the highest chance to evade an attack you can have is 95%. So I'm curious if a lot of this bonus will be wasted, or if this will be helpful in getting players up to that cap. Evasion is a meaningful defensive layer, but it's a little bit nebulous, it's kind of inconsistent, you can be fine all the time, and then, you know, you can still end up getting one shot by a boss if they happen to roll and be the one that hits you, so just something to keep in mind there. If any of these nodes end up being the ones that players take, I expect it to be these two, but time will tell. Okay, now on to the offensive nodes. I know I'm a little bit skeptical on a lot of these defensive ones, but I'm excited for a lot of what the Amazon has to offer offensively here. So I think this critical strike path along the bottom, critical strike and penetrate, these seem pretty straightforward and like pretty substantial damage buffs for the class. So with critical strike, your chance to hit can exceed 100%, and then your critical hit chance goes up based on, you know, how much you are exceeding your chance to hit. This synergizes pretty nicely with the penetrate node because your attacks have additional physical damage based on your accuracy, which you'll want to be pumping up to exceed this chance to hit on critical strike more consistently. So I think that this whole path will synergize pretty nicely with builds that are focusing critical hit, and I think that that is kind of a cool potential play style for the Amazon. Continuing up here, we get into the predatory instinct and in for the kill tree branch, and I'm maybe the most excited for this one. So there's this whole new mechanic being added with like weakness and wounds, I think is the term here. We don't yet know exactly how this will work, but rare and unique enemies will get this kind of reveal weakness debuff or status, and then somehow with that you'll be able to open weakness on those enemies, and then when you do that, certain interesting stuff will happen. You'll do more damage, but if you spec all the way into this branch, you'll then get 20% increased movement speed and 40% increased skill speed. And then along the way, you also have a passive skill speed buff. We don't yet know what this node is, but presumably it will also be some kind of offensive mechanic, hopefully also increase skill speed, because skill speed is actually pretty potent. It's a kind of damage bucket that doesn't have a lot going on. Anytime you can increase skill speed, it usually will up your damage quite a bit because there's not a lot of things that do it, so like a minor percentage increase there will pretty drastically increase your DPS. So with that in mind, this 40% skill speed increase combined with this 4%, maybe 8%, I think this will be pretty good on rare and unique enemies. This won't do much when there aren't those kind of enemies present, but like I said before, I think the content that tends to be the thing that is killing players right now are like bosses or just enemies that hit really hard. So I think that this branch is pretty likely to be pretty heavily used as well. Then finally up here we have the kind of elemental branch. There's like these infusion skills here. Certain kind of charges when consumed will give your weapons cold infusion, which will make them do more elemental damage. I'm a little bit skeptical of this just because I think when branching out across multiple elemental damage types, it can be tricky to kind of balance them and tune your gear and your passives to work with all three types or to take advantage of them. Maybe this will be good even if you can focus one or two, or maybe it'll be possible to kind of balance all three of them and have some really cool synergistic builds there. I don't feel like we've seen much of that yet, and I could be wrong, but I'm a little bit skeptical on this. So overall, I would say, I think that these bottom two branches on this tree both have pretty high damage potential. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of builds end up running these 8 nodes, just because I think the kind of core math on them will be pretty strong, and they will work with quite a few different playstyles. The beauty of the Amazon class here is that there is kind of a simplicity in a lot of these skills. A lot of these things are pretty straightforward in a way that I think will empower a lot of different kinds of builds, different kinds of weapons, stuff like that. So I'm actually pretty excited to try an Amazon with like a bow. I think that'll actually be a pretty interesting combo, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. For now, let's jump in and talk about the ritualist, which is not quite as straightforward. We'll kind of go through the same process with the ritualist here. So starting in the upper right, we've got this kind of blood boil branch. How blood boil works is as you fight enemies, they will get these blood boils that when you kill them will then rupture and do a bunch of damage to the stuff around them. I think this will be pretty interesting, and like I'm sure this will be a kind of fun build to play. It'll feel cool to do this. But to the point I made earlier about bosses being the thing that I think are the true challenge at endgame, at least currently, I'm skeptical that this will be very effective. There's typically adds in a lot of these boss fights, but not all of them, and I'm skeptical that these blood boils will do enough damage on those adds to really be meaningful, and for that reason I'm not sure how much this will actually get run. So the ritual sacrifice branch here is kind of a similar story. How ritual sacrifice works is that when you kill enemies, you can kind of like extract an essence from them, and they give you a power based on what kind of enemy you just killed. I think it sounds like a super interesting playstyle, and I'm excited to play this one as well. But again, I'm a little bit skeptical of the kind of potency of this late and like pushing late endgame, because when fighting bosses and stuff, I think it'll be tricky to get one of these powers from a mob and then happen to get into the boss fight within the time window that you have after acquiring one of these powers and using that using it effectively to do additional damage. So maybe there's some mechanical answer they have to this. One could argue that this end node here, the whispers where you can use it on yourself to get a random modifier, is why that's there. But I'm always a little bit skeptical of these kind of randomness things, especially for boss fights. It's like, well, then you have to keep popping it until you get one of these 3 or 4 powers. Again, I think this will be like a fun playstyle, and if that's kind of what you're into and you don't care about meta and blasting, give it a whirl, but I'm skeptical that this will be super powerful consistently at endgame. The next branch here is all about charms. In the current state of the game, I don't think charms are super interesting because ailments aren't getting inflicted that often. I did a whole video on ailments and ailment threshold. I'll link to that here so you can kind of go check that out and get a better grasp on that system. But based on the Q&A after the live stream, it sounds like there's going to be a significant overhaul, or maybe just lowering, of those ailment thresholds. So we'll be getting hit with ailments as players a little bit more often. So it may be the case that charms become a lot more, interesting. They're a lot more pivotal to your build. And if that's the case, I think that there is some potential here on this charm branch. Having an additional charm slot could be super handy, and being able to convert your mana into charm charges is pretty significant as well. So based on how kind of impactful those changes are, I think this branch actually could be a pretty good defensive layer, and I'm excited to mess with this one a little bit. The final branch on this left side is all about life recovery. This kind of shares a similar problem to the life leech I talked about earlier, wherein when dying it tends to be the big 1 or 2 shots, and life recovery isn't usually the problem. Again, it's not always the case, but I don't think that most players will be burning 2 Ascendancy points for a little bit of life recovery here. I could be wrong, but we'll see. Then finally onto the bottom branch. I expect anyone that goes with the Ritualist Ascendancy will be running these nodes, because this seems to kind of be the Ritualist's thing. So you get Unfurled Finger, which gives you an additional ring slot, and then a 25% bonus with Mystic Attunement to all equipped rings and amulets. This seems like it could be pretty potent. I think there'll be some like wild kind of meta breaking builds here when people figure out, certain uniques and how to just juice those up like crazy. But I do think that this whole Ascendancy might kind of be based on that. Like, you'll need to have a specific ring or set of rings in mind to really make this hum. So I'm not sure that this one will be quite as generalist as the Amazon. There'll be some specific playstyles that are empowered by this, and they'll be cool to see, but I don't think they'll be kind of as consistently well suited to all aspects of the game as I expect the Amazon to be. So with a better grasp on how these Ascendancies work, let's talk about the Spear and Buckler a little bit, and how I expect the passive tree to play into these Ascendancies. The Buckler is like a shield that gives you this new parry ability. Parry is like a defensive skill that you'll hold, and then when enemies attack you while you are holding that skill, they'll be stunned and given this kind of stun attribute. It looks like then a lot of the Spear abilities will kind of combo off of that, so it seems that the Spear and Buckler were really designed to be used together. Maybe some of the abilities that don't combo are just fine without it, but it looks like that was really the design direction they were intending to take here. I'm a little bit leery of the parry mechanic, because with it they're introducing this stun build-up meter for the player. It looks like once the stun bar is filled, you'll be kind of hard stunned, the longer stun animation, and when that's happened, there's not much you can do. You're kind of just standing there and vulnerable. I think a lot of this will come down to how easy it is for that stun bar to be rapidly filled by 1 or 2 big hits. If that is the case, I think it may just feel really punishing to try to be playing this parry build. So I hope that's not enough to kind of detract too much from the spear overall, because I think that the spear looks like a pretty cool weapon. The spear is all based on these combos where you're getting into and out of combat quickly. We don't actually have the full attack set yet, so we don't know the semantics of those skills exactly, but it looks like it's very combo based, and the class in general looks like it's a very mobile class that will kind of incentivize positioning and moving around the battlefield quickly. So with that like mobility focus in mind, I think it'll be interesting to talk about the skill tree a little bit here. As I said before, we can kind of see that the Ascendancy seems to branch off of this node, so we can be pretty confident that we'll be stemming from here for the Huntress as well. We'll see how many of these nodes change. If you haven't noticed this before, depending on what class you're playing, some parts of the tree will change, usually the parts closer to the origin, like to where you're starting. But as these nodes are all projectile damage, it's possible that these are still the same, as it seems the spear will be a projectile weapon at least, like 50% of the time. It also makes sense that the Huntress would kind of be stemming from here, as to the north we have these nodes that are kind of focused on elemental damage and stuff like that. We also have a lot of nodes that are accuracy rating, and like we said on the Amazon, there's that whole path that kind of ramps up your damage based on your accuracy. And yeah, there's just like a lot of projectile damage nodes kind of in this region as well, so it'll be interesting to see how many of these actually change. It's also worth noting that in the Q&A, they noted that for the Huntress's version of this tree, they did their best not to add a lot of nodes that would specifically buff up spear abilities. So even with the Ranger version of this tree, assuming a ton of it doesn't change for the Huntress, I think that there's a pretty clear path to like a bow wielding Amazon specifically, based on those kind of two bottom branches we talked about earlier, that will be doing a lot of like crit based on a very high accuracy rating with a very high projectile speed, especially when fighting bosses. Hopefully we get a little bit more detail on some of these finer points when we get the full patch notes for 0.2.0 in a couple of days. If there's any kind of ambiguity with parry specifically, or if it's anything like evasion where we don't know the formulas, I'll probably do a follow-up video to this as soon as we figure anything out, so if that's of interest, consider subscribing. We also chat about a lot of this in the Discord, like as we figure this stuff out, so consider hopping in. I'll put a link to that in the video description. And finally, I'll be playing Dawn of the Hunt right around launch on Twitch, so you can catch me there. A link to that in the video description as well. But anyway, thank you for watching, take it easy, have a good one.